Imagine waking up in a world where nearly 1 in every 4 people lives under the same flag. A world where ships carrying the Union Jack sailed across every ocean, connecting continents through trade, conquest, migration, and exploration. At its greatest extent, the British Empire stretched across nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed hundreds of millions of people. It became the largest empire in human history, earning the famous description, the empire on which the sun never sets. But how did a small island nation in northwestern Europe build an empire that reached every inhabited continent? What drove its astonishing expansion? How did its rule transform the lives of millions, from London to Delhi, from Cairo to Sydney, from Cape Town to Hong Kong? And why does the legacy of the British Empire continue to shape politics, language, law, trade, and culture even today? This is the story of ambition, exploration, innovation, conflict, resistance, and transformation. This is the story of the British Empire. The British Empire Documentary, Part 2, The Birth of an Empire. At the beginning of the 16th century, England was far from being the world's dominant power. Compared with the powerful empires of Spain and Portugal, England possessed a relatively small navy, limited overseas influence, and few colonies. Yet everything began to change during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. English sailors explored new sea routes, merchants searched for profitable markets, and shipbuilders developed stronger vessels capable of crossing vast oceans. Exploration was driven by several goals: expanding trade, securing valuable resources, increasing political influence, and competing with rival European powers. In 1600, the English crown granted a royal charter to the English East India Company. Initially created as a trading company, it would later become one of the most influential commercial organizations in history, establishing trading posts across Asia and eventually playing a major role in the governance of large parts of the Indian subcontinent. During the early 17th century, England also established permanent settlements in North America and the Caribbean. Colonies such as Jamestown became important centers for trade and migration, laying the foundations of a growing overseas empire. The oceans became England's highways. Merchant ships carried textiles, metals, and manufactured goods, while returning with products such as spices, tea, sugar, and other commodities that transformed markets back home. By the end of the 17th century, England had evolved from a regional kingdom into an expanding maritime power, setting the stage for the rise of what would eventually become the British Empire. The British Empire Documentary, Part 3. The Empire Expands Across the World. During the 18th century, Britain's overseas possessions expanded at an extraordinary pace. Victory in major conflicts, growing naval strength, and expanding trade networks transformed Britain into one of the world's leading powers. The Royal Navy became the backbone of the empire, protecting sea routes that connected Europe with Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. As British ships crossed the oceans, new colonies, trading ports, and military bases were established across the globe. In North America, Britain controlled 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, while Canada gradually became another important part of the empire. In the Caribbean, islands such as Jamaica and Barbados became major producers of sugar, generating enormous wealth through plantation economies that relied heavily on enslaved labor. Meanwhile, Britain's influence in India expanded rapidly. What began as commercial trade through the East India Company gradually developed into political and military control over vast regions. By the late 18th century, Britain had become a truly global empire. Its ships carried goods, soldiers, administrators, scientists, and settlers across oceans, connecting distant continents in ways never seen before. Yet this rapid expansion also brought conflict, resistance, and profound changes for the millions of people living under British rule. The empire was becoming larger than anyone could have imagined. The British Empire Documentary. Part 4. India, the Jewel in the Crown. Of all Britain's overseas territories, none was more important than India. British involvement began through trade. In the early 17th century, the English East India Company established trading posts along India's coastline, exchanging textiles, spices, tea, and other valuable goods. Over time, commercial influence expanded into political power. Following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company gained increasing control over parts of the Indian subcontinent through military victories, alliances, and diplomacy. By the early 19th century, the company governed vast territories and millions of people. In 1857, a large uprising broke out against company rule, known in Britain as the Indian Mutiny and in India as the First War of Independence or the Revolt of 1857. The conflict marked a turning point in the history of the subcontinent. After the rebellion was suppressed, the British government dissolved the East India Company's rule, and in 1858, authority passed directly to the British Crown, beginning the period known as the British Raj. During this era, thousands of kilometers of railways, telegraph lines, ports, canals, and public institutions were developed. These projects improved communication and administration, while also supporting trade and the movement of goods and troops across the subcontinent. At the same time, colonial rule brought profound hardship for many communities. Economic policies, political control, and several devastating famines remain the subject of extensive historical research and debate. Across India, people organized movements demanding greater rights, representation, and ultimately independence. For Britain, India became known as the jewel in the crown because of its economic importance and strategic position. For millions of Indians, however, this period was also marked by struggle, resistance, and a growing desire for self-rule. The story of British India is therefore one of commerce and infrastructure, but also of conflict, change, and the enduring pursuit of freedom. The British Empire Documentary. Part 5. Africa, Australia, Canada, and beyond, 510 to 650. Narration, English. By the 19th century, the British Empire had expanded across nearly every inhabited continent. Each territory had its own history, people, and culture. Britain's relationships with these regions were not identical. Some became settler colonies, others remained trading ports, protectorates, or territories administered in different ways. In Canada, British rule gradually evolved toward self-government. After the formation of the Dominion of Canada in 1867, the country gained increasing control over its own internal affairs while remaining part of the British Empire. In Australia, the first permanent British settlement was established at Sydney Cove in 1788. Over time, new colonies developed into thriving towns and cities. However, this expansion came at a tremendous cost to many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, whose lands, cultures, and ways of life were profoundly disrupted. Across New Zealand, British settlement increased during the 19th century following the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. The treaty remains a central and often debated part of New Zealand's history, particularly regarding the rights and sovereignty of the Maori people. In Asia, Britain controlled major ports such as Hong Kong, which developed into one of the world's most important centers of international trade. By the early 20th century, the British Empire covered approximately 24% of the world's land area and governed roughly 1/4 of the global population. Never before had one empire connected so many distant lands across the globe. The British Empire Documentary. Part 6. The Decline of the British Empire. By the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire had reached its greatest size. It stretched across continents and governed hundreds of millions of people. But maintaining such a vast empire came at an enormous cost. The First World War from 1914 to 1918 placed immense pressure on Britain's economy and military. Millions of soldiers from across the empire, including India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and many African colonies, served in the conflict. Although Britain emerged on the victorious side, the war left the country financially weakened. Just 2 decades later, the Second World War brought even greater challenges. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain again relied heavily on the people and resources of its colonies and dominions. The war ended in Allied victory, but Britain's economy had been severely strained. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, demands for self-government and independence grew stronger. Nationalist movements gained momentum as people called for the right to determine their own futures. One of the most significant turning points came in 1947 when India and Pakistan became independent. This marked the beginning of a broader wave of decolonization. During the following decades, countries including Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Malaysia, Cyprus, and many Caribbean nations achieved independence through different paths and at different times. By the late 20th century, most territories that had once formed the British Empire had become independent sovereign states. Although the empire itself came to an end, many former territories chose to cooperate through the Commonwealth of Nations, an international association that promotes dialogue, development, and voluntary collaboration among its member states. The era of the British Empire had ended, but its influence on the modern world continued. The British Empire Documentary. Part 7. The Legacy of the British Empire. Empires may rise and fall, but their influence often lasts for generations. More than ever, the legacy of the British Empire remains visible across the modern world. Today, English is one of the world's most widely spoken languages, serving as a global language for business, science, diplomacy, aviation, technology, and international communication. Many countries that were once part of the British Empire continue to use legal systems based on English common law, parliamentary traditions inspired by the Westminster system, and public institutions that developed during the colonial period, though these have also evolved according to local histories and democratic choices. Railways, ports, roads, universities, and administrative buildings constructed during the colonial era still form part of the infrastructure of many nations. At the same time, historians continue to examine the unequal economic relationships, forced labor in some colonies, land dispossession, and cultural disruption associated with imperial rule. Across the former empire, memories of this history are diverse. For some, it is associated with trade, institutional development, and global connections. For others, it is remembered through experiences of exploitation, discrimination, violence, and struggles for independence. These different perspectives are not mutually exclusive. They reflect the complex realities of an empire that affected hundreds of millions of lives over several centuries. Today, countries once linked by the British Empire cooperate in many ways through diplomacy, education, trade, sports, and organizations such as the Commonwealth of Nations. The empire itself has disappeared, but its influence continues to shape borders, languages, institutions, and international relationships in the 21st century. The British Empire. Part 8. Conclusion. The Empire that Changed the World. For more than 3 centuries, the British Empire stood at the center of global events. At its greatest extent, it stretched across every inhabited continent, governing nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. Its ships crossed the world's oceans, its railways connected distant cities, its language spread across continents, its legal traditions, political institutions, and systems of education influenced many nations. Yet, the empire's story is not one of achievement alone. It is also a story of conquest, unequal power, resistance, displacement, and the determination of people who fought for self-government and independence. Across the former empire, this history continues to be remembered in different ways. Some view it through the lens of economic development, scientific progress, and global connections. Others remember the human costs, the loss of sovereignty, and the lasting effects of colonial rule. Understanding the British Empire means recognizing both its global influence and the experiences of the millions of people whose lives it shaped. History is rarely simple. It is built from many voices, many perspectives, and many truths. Today, the nations that were once connected through the British Empire have followed their own paths. They are independent countries with unique identities, cultures, and aspirations, contributing to a world that is more interconnected than ever before. The British Empire no longer exists, but its legacy remains visible in borders, languages, institutions, cultures, and in the ongoing conversations about history, justice, and identity. The story of the British Empire is not merely the story of Britain, it is the story of a world transformed. And perhaps the greatest lesson history offers is this: empires may rise, empires may fall, but their impact can echo across generations. Thank you for watching.